Love Maginot by Red and Catherine Rahm, as read by the author. Chapter 1. It is the soup that makes the soldier. French proverb. Pierre hesitantly touched the table and slid his hand against Josette's. His palm skated on the stainless steel surface, gliding over a sifted layer of flour. Only his right pinky grazed her left. He wanted to, but dared not cover her hand more. The contact was genuine and illicit and delicious. Since he was a toddler 17 years ago, he had not touched the bare skin of a woman other than his mother. His was not from an extended family, nor communal when showing affection. Even at church as a small boy, he would squirm away from the gloved hands of the older, pinching and hugging widows. He had no other women as relatives. There were only harsh tales of his grandmothers on either side of his family. His mother evaded all questions as to whether they would visit, if they still lived, or if they had graves in need of flowers. He prayed every evening for their souls to be happy, his mother's too, and, since meeting her, for Josette's. Pierre reflected on his mother. He respected her, but she showed him little affection. He never learned what to expect, when to act, how to approach a woman with desire. He could converse politely with a female customer, but Josette was not flirting her way through an order of afternoon ausles. She was working for him. She was his student, but a novice no longer. He instructed her, but neither was focused completely on culinary technique. He enjoyed their meetings. He missed her when she would leave. He would practice making conversation while basting or stirring the evening's main course. There had to be a bit of sizzle or boil in the background to cover his hushed tone. He was embarrassed to feel so ill at ease. Back in the moment, he looked at her green eyes and soft brow, counted the freckles on her nose. Josette scrunched her face to mock his silent stare. He mumbled practical words of encouragement to her, something his mother would say while making bread. Salt controls the yeast, some to staunch rise, some more to add texture. He guided her hands to squish the dough. His entire focus returned to his 10th digit, the one electrically locked to Josette. His mouth dried as he rhythmically breathed and twisted the dough. In his throat he felt his own heartbeat, but imagined he was joined in feeling hers. He filled his lungs for the euphoria and the courage, reaching further, touching the cool, hard, golden band on her ring finger. Josette pulled her hand away, but only to secure the bangs escaping out of her scarf. The act left her forehead dusted with a light brush stroke of flour. She returned her hand to the table and covered his. He exhaled and swallowed. Their 4 hands, 4 rhythmic forces, molded the dough. He had rescued her from the scullery. Under his tutelage, she no longer spent her hours scouring drains. Now she dragged a bin with uneven casters, hauling kitchen refuse out to the hog pen. Rescue might be too strong a term, but this was undeniably an improvement over her previous job. And yet they both enjoyed sharing the kitchen and the closeness of their labors. The aroma of baking bread, tempting the mouth to sample, accentuated the time that they spent together. Josette thought nothing of his contact, not at first. She admired his hands, the scars from drawing a knife too close when paring fruit, the indelible white spots where grease had splattered. She grinned and looked at his face, his nut-brown hair covered by a faded red handkerchief, his velvet brown eyes ringed by the lightest of lashes. His touch still seemed instructional. He was intent only on the sticky paste, dousing it with the final dashes of flour, drying its surface with each fold. She blinked, and something flashed emotionally. For the briefest of moments she dared to see his intent cleanly. The thought made her blush, and was therefore quickly discarded. Logically, what would a young man want with a woman twice his age? Well, almost twice his age. Actually, she knew what a young man would want. She hardly had a day go by when she wasn't propositioned, for the most part playfully. There were many men and few women who worked in the same secluded place. She was accustomed to garish offers, pleas for womanly mercies. Her business contract forbade such fraternizations. She needed the job, but also knew she was serving her country, being a patriot. Girlish inclinations no longer controlled her acts. Her days as a teen flapper were behind her. Josette tried to focus, channel his passion to the task. He was an artisan, a master chef, a prodigy who might have been attending culinary school in Paris if not for the start of war in September 1939. His family owned a cafe. This he had told her. She was a former performer, a person who had tried everything and was left wondering what happened to 20 years of her life. Good times, but the past. Instead of competing and taking and grabbing all life could give, she found contentment, or wanted to be content, with caring and giving and serving. Pierre was suddenly close. The room was shrinking. Was he trying to ask her out? That would be silly. She would stop flattering herself. A young, talented man like Pierre would have many does as his fawning fans. She spoke to distract her inappropriate thoughts. "How did your mother react when you were drafted?" "I guess she expected me to leave. That was almost a year ago. All men in France are selected to serve." Josette thought of her own family, of the indulgences still enjoyed by the rich. None of her uncles had been forced as conscripts. Only the poor universally served. "I guess we all do our share for France." Josette and Pierre stood inside and under the fortress wall called the Maginot Line. France had won the previous war, but did not feel the victor. To be French was to be paranoid, and rightly so. Germany had risen again. There was the mountainous range of the Alps in the south, and the dense Ardennes forest to the north. The border of Lorraine, however, had no natural defense. It was an oft-used corridor for invasion, completely unprotected, until the Maginot Line was built between the last clash and now. Want to hear something funny? My father had never received post until he got the letter from the government. Never? Neither had I. That must make me seem so pedestrian. She thought his choice of term odd, but she knew he was mimicking someone else, perhaps someone he had met, a traveler who came to his mother's cafe. When was that? When did your father serve? 1922 to 1925. He found himself sharing something that made him feel vulnerable. He added a harder, tragic edge, maybe fishing for sympathy. He would be dead about 2 years later. There was no war? She was confused. She knew the Premier War was over by 1918. Maybe his father had served in the colonies, which every other year seemed to be in revolt. Then she realized he said later, after his service. He was so young. Was it sickness? No, he was killed by accident. How tragic. She felt his loss, and the loss his mother must have felt. She gave him a gentle hug. Her own awkwardness returned, so she separated from him, composed herself, and asked another question. "Your father got his first letter as a draft notice?" The letter informing him of his conscription period came in a brown, not white, wrapping, just like mine. It may have even been the same letter I received. She nodded her agreement and squished some dough between her fingers before finding that embarrassing. Pierre did not notice what she felt. He was covering for his own passion. My mother says that grandmother started to burn it like a bill before anyone dared to open it. The postal clerk wrestled it away. He still works the route to my village. Pierre mimicked his staunch manner. a civic duty, a cause for the Republic. All young men will be allowed to serve. He used about the same speech with me, but he didn't have to. I agree with him. He joined as father did. The older sons of other villagers made the sacrifice, so now I do. Pierre wanted to serve. He needed the distraction. He had been with his mother as his only confiding company for too long. He wanted stories of his own. He motioned that the pan needed to be greased, and the loaves were ready. She knew this, but was neglecting her task. Josette hastened to get the margarine. If the men were to be fed on time, the cook had to stay ahead of the cooking. Pierre chuckled as she ran to the shelf for the wax paper bundle of faux butter. Supplies were getting harder to locate. He had to sparingly use true butter for certain dishes. The officers insisted on the very best for all their soldiers, even when it wasn't possible. Perhaps soon he would have to use the can of congealed vegetable oil for every meal's preparation. His mother would have slapped him for even suggesting that. He could not remember a time when he didn't bake. He caught a glimpse of Josette bending over and turned away. My mother bragged to all her customers how I made my first folded pastry at 3. While other children had balls or bikes or tin soldiers, I had cookie cutters and a polished brass, clunky, hand-cranked pasta machine. Your mother sounds perceptive. Audrey, that's my mother, did not cry as I left for here. Maybe she knew not to embarrass me. She's just like her own mother, so even she says. My family doesn't like goodbyes. I was too young, so I don't remember seeing my father leave. I remember him coming back on a bus. My mother says he also left for the army on a bus. The village was more impressed by the bus. I rode away in a truck. Not as many were impressed. He was gone 3 years. I think my mother missed him. Any luck, my service is done in a single year. That should take no time. Josette thought of the present politics. Pierre was kidding himself. He was conscripted for a year of peace. France was at war. On the bright side, Christmas was coming, perhaps a furlough. There hadn't really been any fighting. Was this a good time to be a soldier, or a lousy one? Was it better to be already in service, or waiting to be called back? France had lost so many young men in the last war. How could it afford to lose any more? The Maginot Line was holding the Germans back and away. It was created almost entirely to prevent another war. It failed at preventing this war, but Maginot had fostered a phony war between the two nations. That's what the Parisian press had dubbed the last 4 months without true battle. Your mother must miss you. I would miss you. He liked hearing her say she would miss him, but now he worried about his mother. How would the café be handling rationing? I hope some soldiers stationed at the aerodrome make up for the lost tourists. I'm sad to say it, but the German sportsmen were better spenders than the British. Relations between France and Germany were a mess. But they were always a mess. France had won the war to end all wars. No one was calling it that anymore. Germany was humiliated and defeated. 20 years after armistice, the German army sacked Poland. The Poles did not have, and could have used, a Maginot Line of their own. France and Britain were steadfast in making the Germans and Russians stop the occupation and withdraw. All this was flashing through her thoughts. That, and she suddenly wanted to touch the curl of hair sticking out over his ear. We all seem safe, Josette said. 36. Now that must have been a scary time to serve. Why? What happened? The Germans put soldiers back into the Rhineland. They were not supposed to do that. That's what I remember from reading. Pierre only vaguely knew his geography. The Rhine was a river. It was near France. He did not wish to show too much of his ignorance. Instead, he suggested, maybe they've left. She chuckled, thinking he made light of the turmoil between the nations. She glanced from dropping the last of 60 loaves on trays to look at him. He and men like him would protect her. protect all of France. And there was Maginot, the greatest defensive barrier since the Great Wall of China. Josette tried to calm her racing thoughts. There was so much to contend with, things she understood and others about which she hadn't a clue. She knew China, too, was at war. Was their Great Wall of any use against their enemy, Japan? The older men of my village, Pierre started to say, I served them wine. They are fond of saying, that wretched place should have been burned barren. Josette did not respond. She was wondering if those men were right. Or were other men right, that the mistake was leaving Germany too weak, too poor? Hitler was a symptom and a false cure. Pierre thought he made a mistake in speaking. He returned to what he knew, cooking, adding his own political twist. Germans do not decide when sugar becomes a caramelized glaze. This gave her comfort. She liked glaze, and again she admired the confidence he showed in France. Pierre held none of those veterans' animosity. He didn't hate the Germans. He didn't truly know any of them. Nor did he realize that his region, Alsace-Lorraine, was as much German as French, in heritage and in language. The two countries, two cultures, fought over the area and traded ownership throughout history. Pierre had no understanding of or the desire to learn history. He had reached that age when a boy stopped being a teen, and the man needed a break from every routine. His life was cooking, yet here he was, cooking still. But at least he had Josette as an eager student, not his mother as a disinterested teacher. He had prayed once or twice for the draft letter to arrive. Prayers sometimes are answered. Or is it that all prayers are answered, the answer most often being no? Their job for today was almost done. She would be leaving. Pierre had to decide, now or wait for tomorrow. He shifted closer, took a tray from her hands. Reaching across the back of Josette's waist, he managed only to tangle in the tie of her apron. He clenched his teeth and screwed forth the nerve to look at her straight on. Forcing a smile, he got lost in the green of her eyes, his nervous leer emphatically seen as desire. She felt something of her own, not just his advance, but a warmth from somewhere else. Heat from the oven, perhaps, on her neck, and as a flush in her cheeks. Her eyes closed. Something between them was changing. Something she dared to think possible was real. She had known love, and here it simmered again, coming as predictably as just a moment before it had been impossible to expect. The lights flickered, though the room did not rumble. The Germans were shelling mightily. The attack must have knocked out the power lines into Block 7 of Maginot. It would take a moment for the electricity to switch over to the local underground source. Emboldened by darkness, Josette became the aggressor, kissing Pierre, placing his hands. The German artillery was aimed squarely at their bunker, but neither of them held any fear, nor hatred, nor doubt.